What kind of person calls the cops over a flower bed? That's the question that burned in my mind the day Karen Wentworth decided I was her personal enemy. I'd barely poured my morning coffee when the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, like a warning shot. Through the peephole, I saw two officers, their navy uniforms stark against the pastel backdrop of our quiet street. My stomach dropped. I wasn't a criminal, hadn't even gotten a parking ticket in years. So why were they here? I opened the door, and the older officer, a man with a graying mustache and tired eyes, asked, "Are you Daniel Harper?" I nodded, my throat tight. "We got a complaint about your property. Something about unapproved landscaping." I blinked, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. Landscaping? My front yard, with its wild mix of daisies and lavender, was my pride and joy. Then it hit me, Karen. The HOA president who patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk, her clipboard a weapon, her smile a thinly veiled threat. I wasn't even in the HOA. My little bungalow sat just outside the gated community's boundary, a fact that had always stuck in Karen's craw. But this was war. I invited the officers to see the yard for themselves. They shuffled behind me, boots crunching on gravel, as I pointed out the flower beds I'd spent months cultivating. The younger cop, a woman with a tight ponytail, scribbled notes, her face unreadable. "Looks fine to me," the older one muttered, glancing at the vibrant blooms. "But we have to follow up on complaints." I asked who made the call. They exchanged a look, then the woman said, "Karen Wentworth. Says your yard violates community standards." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Community standards? I'm not in her community. The officers nodded, clearly uncomfortable, and left with a vague promise to look into it. I stood in my driveway, the morning sun warm on my face, but inside, I was seething. Karen thought she could bully me into submission. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I'd moved to this neighborhood 2 years ago, seeking peace after a messy divorce. The bungalow was my fresh start, a place to rebuild. I'd spent hours in that yard, hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the soil. It wasn't just flowers, it was therapy, a way to stitch myself back together. Karen, though, saw my wild garden as a personal affront. She'd sent letters before, crisp envelopes with the HOA logo, demanding I conform to their rules. I'd ignored them, tossing each one in the trash. I wasn't bound by their covenants, and she knew it. But calling the cops? That was a new low. I paced my living room, the walls lined with photos of my kids, their smiles a reminder of why I fought to keep this place my own. Karen wasn't just attacking my yard. She was attacking my freedom. That afternoon, I marched across the invisible line that separated my property from the HOA's manicured empire. Karen's house was a monument to control. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a lawn like a golf course, not a leaf out of place. I knocked, my pulse pounding in my ears. She opened the door, her eyes narrowing behind designer glasses. "Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. What a surprise. I didn't waste time. "Why'd you call the cops on me?" Her smile tightened, but she didn't flinch. "Your yard is an eyesore. It lowers property values for everyone." I stepped closer, my voice low. "I'm not in your HOA, Karen. You don't get to control me." She tilted her chin, unfazed. "This neighborhood has standards. If you can't meet them, maybe you don't belong here." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about flowers. It was about power. I spent the next few days digging into Karen's tactics. Neighbors whispered stories over backyard fences, fines for unapproved mailboxes, threats over kids' chalk drawings, even a family pressured to move after Karen deemed their dog too loud. She ruled through fear, her authority unchallenged because no one dared fight back. But I wasn't like them. I'd faced worse than a suburban dictator in my life. Court battles, betrayal, the kind of pain that hardens you. I started researching property laws, poring over city ordinances and my deed. My lot was grandfathered out of the HOA's jurisdiction, a fact Karen conveniently ignored. I found an ally in Mrs. Ellison, the elderly woman next door, who'd lived here before the HOA even existed. "Karen's been after me for years," she said, her voice crackling with defiance. "She hates anyone who doesn't bow." Mrs. Ellison's yard was a jungle of roses, a middle finger to Karen's rules. I liked her already. By the end of the week, I had a plan. I'd fight Karen on her own turf, not with anger, but with strategy. I printed flyers detailing my property's exemption and the HOA's overreach, citing legal codes I'd unearthed. I slipped them into mailboxes across the neighborhood, avoiding Karen's street cameras. The response was immediate. Neighbors I'd never spoken to knocked on my door, sharing their own Karen horror stories. One man, Javier, told me she'd find him for parking his work truck in his driveway. "I'm a contractor," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "It's my livelihood." Another woman, Priya, said Karen had reported her for unapproved holiday lights. The stories piled up, each one fueling my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my yard, I was fighting for all of us. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. While digging through public records, I stumbled on a bombshell. Karen's own house wasn't fully compliant with city codes. Her backyard shed, a pristine structure she bragged about at HOA meetings, was built without a permit. It was a small thing, but in her world of rules, it was a chink in her armor. I sat back in my chair, the glow of my laptop illuminating the room, and grinned. Karen thought she could weaponize the law against me, but two could play that game. I didn't want to sink to her level, but the irony was too perfect. I filed a quiet complaint with the city, requesting an inspection. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd show her I could keep up. The neighborhood buzzed with tension in the days that followed. My flyers had stirred something, like a pebble dropped in a still pond. People whispered in grocery store aisles, exchanged knowing glances at mailboxes. Karen's iron grip was slipping, and she knew it. I caught her watching me from her porch one morning, her eyes sharp as knives. I waved, a small act of defiance, and she turned away, her lips a thin line. But I wasn't naive. Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, and I braced for her next move. It came faster than I expected. A new letter arrived, this time from the city, not the HOA. It claimed my flower beds violated a vague aesthetic ordinance and demanded I remove them within 30 days or face fines. The language was formal, but I could practically hear Karen's voice behind it. She'd escalated, pulling strings I didn't even know she had. I wasn't about to let her win. I called a lawyer friend, Sam, who specialized in property disputes. Over coffee at my kitchen table, he skimmed the letter, his brow furrowing. "This is flimsy," he said, tossing it down. "The city's ordinance is so vague it's barely enforceable. She's bluffing, banking on you backing down." I leaned back, my mind racing. "So what do I do?" Sam grinned, his eyes glinting with mischief. "You push back. Request a hearing, demand evidence. Make her work for it." I like the sound of that. I filed a formal appeal with the city, attaching my deed and a detailed history of Karen's harassment. I also reached out to Javier and Priya, rallying them to join me at the hearing. If Karen wanted a fight, she'd get one in front of the whole town. The hearing was set for 2 weeks later, giving me time to prepare. I spent evenings with Mrs. Ellison, sipping tea on her cluttered porch as she shared decades of neighborhood lore. She told me about the HOA's founding, how it started as a way to keep the streets clean, but morphed into Karen's personal fiefdom. "She wasn't always like this," Mrs. Ellison said, her voice soft. "Lost her husband a few years back. Threw herself into controlling everything else." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Grief could twist people, make them cling to power like a lifeline. But it didn't excuse her tyranny. I thanked Mrs. Ellison and went home, my resolve hardened. Karen's pain wasn't my burden. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I stood in my yard, the moonlight casting shadows over the flowers. Each bloom felt like a small rebellion, a piece of me that refused to bend. I thought of my kids who loved running through the garden when they visited, their laughter echoing in my memory. This wasn't just about me. It was about showing them what it meant to stand up. By dawn, I was ready. The city hall was a squat, gray building, its meeting room packed with neighbors. Karen sat at the front, her posture rigid, her face a mask of calm. I recognized a few allies, Javier, Priya, Mrs. Ellison, but most of the crowd was neutral, curious to see how this would play out. The city official, a balding man named Mr. Thompson, called the meeting to order. I stood, my heart pounding, and presented my case. My property's exemption, Karen's overreach, the absurdity of her complaint. I held up photos of my yard, vibrant and alive, and compared them to the HOA's sterile lawns. Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen stood next, her voice smooth and practiced. She spoke of community pride and shared values, painting me as an outsider who threatened their way of life. It was a performance and a good one. I could see some neighbors nodding, swayed by her polish. But then came the twist that turned the tide. Mrs. Ellison, frail but fierce, stood up and shuffled to the podium. "I've lived here 40 years, she said, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Karen's shed is illegal. No permit." I checked. Gasps broke out, and Karen's face went pale. Mrs. Ellison sat down, a tiny smile on her lips. I hadn't expected her to drop that bomb in public, but it was perfect. Karen scrambled to respond, stammering about minor oversights, but the damage was done. The room was alive with whispers, doubt creeping into the eyes of her loyalists. Mr. Thompson adjourned the meeting, promising a decision within days. I left the hall feeling lighter, like I'd shed a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. Javier clapped me on the back, his grin wide. "You shook her up, man." Priya hugged me, her eyes bright with hope. But I knew it wasn't over. Karen's pride wouldn't let her quit. Sure enough, the next morning, I found a new notice taped to my door. A fine from the HOA for non-compliance, despite my exemption. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch effort to intimidate me. I tore it down, my hands shaking with anger. Karen was doubling down, and I had to be ready for whatever she threw next. The fine was a slap in the face, but it only fueled my fire. I called Sam again, and he laughed when I read in the notice. "She's got nothing," he said. "It's unenforceable. Keep pushing." I did more than push, I went all in. I organized a neighborhood meeting, renting a community center room with my own money. I sent out invites, carefully worded to avoid Karen's radar, framing it as a neighborhood unity event. To my surprise, over 30 people showed up, their faces a mix of curiosity and frustration. Javier brought his wife, Maria, who shared how Karen's fines had strained their budget. Priya spoke of the holiday lights incident, her voice breaking as she described her kids' disappointment. Even Mrs. Ellison came, leaning on her cane, her eyes sharp with purpose. I laid out the truth. Karen's HOA was overstepping, targeting not just me, but anyone who dared to be different. I showed them my deed, the city codes, the evidence of her shed. The room buzzed with anger, but also hope. We weren't alone anymore. Karen caught wind of the meeting, of course. The next day, she sent an email blast to the HOA accusing me of sowing discord and undermining community values. She announced an emergency HOA meeting to address the crisis. I wasn't invited, but Javier was, and he texted me updates. Karen was in full damage control mode, rallying her loyalists with promises of stricter enforcement and restored order. But Javier said the mood was tense. People were questioning her, emboldened by the meeting I'd held. I felt a flicker of triumph, but I didn't let it go to my head. Karen was cornered, and cornered animals were dangerous. The city's decision came a week later. Mr. Thompson called me personally, his voice gruff but kind. "Your appeal's been granted. No violation on your property. The ordinance doesn't apply." I exhaled, relief flooding me. But then he added, "We're also looking into Ms. Wentworth's shed. No permit on file." I thanked him, my mind already racing to the next step. Karen's defeat on my case was a blow, but her shed was still under review. I knew she'd come for me harder now, and I was right. That evening, I found my flower beds vandalized, lavender stalks snapped, daisies uprooted, soil strewn across my driveway. I stood there, the streetlights casting harsh shadows, my chest tight with rage. There was no proof it was Karen, but I knew. This was personal. I didn't call the cops. Instead, I cleaned up the mess, my hands shaking as I replanted what I could. Mrs. Ellison came over, her face etched with worry. "She's losing control," she said. "Be careful, Daniel." I nodded, but careful wasn't my style anymore. I ordered security cameras, small ones I could hide in my trees, and set them up that night. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd catch her in the act. The next day, I filed a vandalism report with the police, not accusing her directly, but making sure it was on record. The same officers from before took my statement, their faces grim. "We'll look into it," the older ones said, but I could tell they were tired of this feud. So was I, but I wasn't backing down. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Karen showed up at my door, her usual polish gone, her eyes wild with anger. "You think you can ruin me?" she hissed, stepping closer than I liked. I held my ground, the camera in my oak tree recording every word. "I'm not the one breaking laws, Karen," I said, my voice steady. "Your shed, your fines, your vendetta, it's all crumbling. She laughed, a brittle sound. You're nothing, Daniel. A nobody with a messy yard. I'll make sure you regret this. She stormed off, and I watched her go, my heart pounding. The cameras had caught it all. Her threat, her rage. It wasn't proof of vandalism, but it was something. I uploaded the footage to a secure drive, my hand steady now. This was war, and I was armed. The neighborhood was splitting, lines drawn in the sand. Some stood with Karen, loyal to her vision of order. Others rallied to me, tired of her reign. Javier and Priya started a petition to reform the HOA, demanding transparency in elections. Mrs. Ellison handed out cookies at our next meeting, her way of softening the tension. But her words were steel. Karen's time is up. I admired her fire, but I worried. Karen wasn't just fighting for control now. She was fighting for her identity. That made her unpredictable. I kept my cameras on, my doors locked, my eyes open. The battle was far from over, and I had a feeling the worst was yet to come. The air in the neighborhood grew heavier, like the calm before a storm. My cameras caught nothing for days, just squirrels and passing cars, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Karen's threat lingered in my mind, a dark cloud over every step I took. I kept working, though, rallying more neighbors to the cause. Our petition gained traction, with over 50 signatures demanding HOA reform. Javier and Priya were tireless, knocking on doors, sharing stories of Karen's overreach. Even Mrs. Ellison chipped in, mailing letters to older residents who couldn't attend meetings. We were building a movement, but every step forward felt like it came at a cost. Karen wasn't silent. She was scheming. Her next move was subtle but vicious. A rumor started circulating, spread through hushed conversations and anonymous posts on the neighborhood app. It claimed I was a deadbeat, dodging taxes and hiding a criminal past. I found out when Priya called, her voice tight with worry. People are talking, Daniel. They're saying you're trouble. I laughed it off at first, but the damage was real. Neighbors who'd been friendly started avoiding my gaze. Even Javier admitted some petition signers were wavering. I felt the sting of betrayal, not from them, but from the ease with which Karen's lies took root. I had to act fast. I invited the core group, Javier, Priya, Mrs. Ellison, to my house and showed them my clean record, my paid taxes, my divorce papers. This is who I am, I said, spreading the documents on my kitchen table. She's trying to break us. They nodded, their trust unshaken, but I knew the wider neighborhood was slipping. I decided to confront the rumors head-on. I posted a statement on the neighborhood app, attaching scans of my records and a calm explanation of Karen's tactics. I didn't name her directly. I didn't need to. The post went viral in our little corner of the world, shared by dozens of residents. Comments poured in, some skeptical, others outraged on my behalf. One, from an anonymous account, read, "Check Karen's own backyard before you judge." I smiled, suspecting Mrs. Ellison's handiwork. The city's shed investigation was still ongoing, and I had a feeling it would tip the scales. But Karen wasn't done. She called another HOA meeting, this time open to all residents, and I knew it was her chance to strike back. I decided to attend, uninvited but unafraid. The meeting was held in the community center, the same room where we'd rallied weeks before. Karen stood at the front, her posture regal, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "We're here to protect our neighborhood," she said, her eyes sweeping over the room, lingering on me. "Some people want to tear us apart, but we won't let them." The crowd murmured, split between her loyalists and those who'd signed our petition. I stood, my heart racing, and asked to speak. Karen's smile faltered, but she couldn't refuse without looking weak. I stepped to the podium, facing a sea of faces, some hostile, some curious. "I'm not your enemy," I said. "I just want to live free, like all of you should." Karen's fines, her rules, they're not about community. They're about control. I held up the petition, now with 60 signatures. "We're asking for a vote, a real one. Let's choose our future." The room erupted, cheers and jeers clashing like thunder. Karen's face was a mask of fury, but she kept her composure. She countered with a slick speech about standards and unity, but her words felt hollow. Then came the twist that shook me. A man I didn't know stood up, his voice trembling. "My name's Tom. Karen threatened to foreclose on my house if I didn't pay her fines. I'm behind on my mortgage." She knew that. The room went silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "Foreclosure?" That was beyond fines, beyond bullying. It was predation. Karen stammered, denying it, but Tom held up a letter, her signature clear as day. The crowd turned, whispers growing into shouts. I saw fear in Karen's eyes for the first time, and I knew we'd hit a nerve. The meeting ended in chaos, with Karen storming out and half the room following her, the other half buzzing with rebellion. I stayed, talking Tom, who was shaking but resolute. He'd been too scared to speak until he saw the petition, saw me standing up. You gave me courage, he said, his voice thick. I clapped his shoulder, my own emotions swirling. This wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about people like Tom, trapped by Karen's power. But I knew she'd retaliate, and I was right. The next morning, my truck's tires were slashed, the word trouble spray-painted on the hood. I stood in my driveway, staring at the damage, my blood boiling. The cameras hadn't caught the culprit, but I didn't need proof to know who was behind it. Karen was unraveling, and she was taking the neighborhood down with her. The slashed tires were a low blow, but they only sharpened my focus. I filed another police report, this time with photos of the damage, and replaced the tires with money I couldn't spare. Javier and Priya showed up to help, their faces grim but determined. She's desperate, Priya said, scrubbing paint off my truck. That means we're winning. I nodded, but winning felt hollow when my life was under siege. The cameras stayed on, their red lights a silent promise to catch Karen's next mistake. I also reached out to a local reporter, a friend of Sam's who'd covered HOA disputes before. Her name was Lisa, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for digging up dirt. I told her everything. Karen's shed, the fines, Tom's foreclosure threat, my vandalized truck. She listened, her pen flying across her notebook. This could be big, she said. Give me a week. Lisa's article hit the local paper like a bomb. Headlined, HOA Horror, One Woman's Reign of Fear. It laid out Karen's tactics in brutal detail, quoting Tom, Javier, and me, along with city records about her shed. The online version spread fast, shared across social media by neighbors and strangers alike. Comments poured in, some from people outside our town who'd faced similar HOA nightmares. Karen's name was trending, and not in a good way. I felt a surge of hope, but also dread. Lisa's article was a weapon, but it would make Karen more dangerous. Sure enough, she doubled down, sending a new round of HOA letters demanding loyalty and threatening legal action against defamers. It was a bluff, but it scared some neighbors back into silence. The city shed investigation concluded a few days later. Karen was ordered to tear it down or face hefty fines. I heard about it from Mrs. Ellison, who'd gotten a call from a friend at City Hall. She's livid, she said, her eyes gleaming. But she's trapped. I wanted to celebrate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had one last card to play. That night, I got a call from an unknown number. A man's voice, low and rough, said, "Back off, or you'll regret it." I hung up, my heart racing, and checked the cameras. Nothing, but the threat felt real, a shadow creeping closer. I told Javier and Priya, who insisted I stay vigilant. She's not done, Javier warned. People like her don't quit. The final showdown came the next HOA election, a tense affair held in the community center. Karen had delayed it as long as she could, but the petition's momentum forced her hand. The room was packed, standing room only, with reporters from Lisa's paper and even a local TV crew. I wasn't running for anything. I wasn't in the HOA, but I was there to support Javier, who'd thrown his hat in for president. Karen took the stage, her smile brittle, and gave a speech about restoring order. But the crowd wasn't buying it. When Javier spoke, promising fairness and transparency, cheers drowned out Karen's loyalists. Then Tom stood, his voice steady now, and shared his foreclosure story again. The room turned on Karen, boos echoing off the walls. She tried to respond, but her words were lost in the noise. For the first time, she looked small, her power stripped away. The vote was a landslide. Javier won, and Karen was out. She left the stage without a word, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. I felt a strange mix of triumph and pity. She'd built her world on control, and now it was gone. The crowd spilled into the parking lot, some celebrating, others stunned. Mrs. Ellison hugged me, her frail arms surprisingly strong. "You did this, Daniel," she said. I shook my head. We did this. But the victory wasn't clean. That night, my cameras caught a figure in a hoodie near my truck, but they fled before I could ID them. Karen was down but not out. I knew she'd linger, a ghost of resentment in our quiet streets. The days after the election felt like a new dawn, but shadows lingered. Javier took over as HOA president, and his first act was to dissolve the draconian rules Karen had enforced. No more fines for unapproved flowers or holiday lights. The neighborhood exhaled, yards blooming with new colors, kids drawing chalk art on sidewalks. My own garden thrived, the scars of vandalism fading as I replanted. But I kept my cameras on, their red lights a reminder of the cost of freedom. Karen's house went quiet, her curtains drawn, her car rarely in the driveway. Some said she was planning to move, others that she was plotting revenge. I didn't know what to believe, but I stayed ready. Lisa's article had sparked a broader conversation. Other neighborhoods reached out, sharing their own HOA horror stories. I started a blog, anonymous at first, to document our fight and offer advice. It grew fast, drawing comments from across the country. People called me a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I was just a guy who loved his flowers and refused to bend. Still, the blog gave me purpose, a way to channel the anger and fear into something bigger. Javier and Priya helped, sharing their stories, while Mrs. Ellison mailed me handwritten notes of encouragement, her spidery script to comfort. We were a team now, bound by the battle we'd won. But Karen wasn't gone. A month after the election, I got a letter from a lawyer claiming I'd slandered her in Lisa's article. It demanded a public apology and $10,000 in damages. I laughed, but was a nervous sound. Sam took one look at the letter and called it legal nonsense, but it still rattled me. Karen was grasping at straws, trying to claw back some control. I refused to engage, letting Sam handle the response. The lawsuit fizzled, but it was a reminder of her reach, even in defeat. Then came the final twist, the one that almost broke me. One night, my cameras caught her, Karen, unmistakable in her sharp bob, sneaking onto my property. She didn't touch my truck or my flowers. Instead, she left a note taped to my door. "You'll never be free." I stood in the dark, reading it under the porch light, my heart pounding. It wasn't a threat. It was a curse. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, the note on the coffee table, my kids' photos watching me from the walls. Karen's words echoed, not because I believed her, but because they tapped into a deeper fear. Freedom wasn't just about winning. It was about living without looking over your shoulder. I called Javier the next morning, and we met with the police, showing them the footage and the note. They took it seriously this time, promising to question her. I don't know what they said, but Karen's house went up for sale a week later. She was gone by spring, her pristine lawn left to wither. The neighborhood threw a block party to celebrate, with music and laughter spilling into the street. I brought my kids, their joy a balm for the scars of the fight. Looking back, I realized the battle wasn't just about Karen. It was about standing up, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd felt her shadow. My yard was more than flowers now. It was a symbol, a reminder that freedom was worth fighting for. I kept blogging, sharing our story, connecting with others who'd faced their own Karens. Mrs. Ellison passed away a year later, her roses still blooming, a quiet tribute to her defiance. I visit her grave sometimes, leaving daisies for my garden. Javier's still president, and the HOA's a shadow of its former self, focused on community, not control. I don't know where Karen went, and I don't care. She lost because we refused to break. My kids run through my yard now, their laughter louder than any threat. This is my home, my freedom, and I'll fight for it every day. The seasons changed, and the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. My garden grew wilder, a riot of colors that drew butterflies and curious kids. Neighbors stopped by to chat, their fences no longer barriers but invitations. Javier's leadership transformed the HOA into something human, with meetings that felt like family gatherings instead of tribunals. Priya started a community garden, and even Tom, once so broken, joined in, planting tomatoes with his kids. The scars of Karen's reign faded, but they didn't disappear. I still check my cameras sometimes, a habit I couldn't shake. Her note, "You'll never be free," sat in a drawer, a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. But we hadn't. We'd won, not just against her, but against the fear she wielded. My blog grew into a small movement, with guest posts from others who'd fought their own battles. I wrote about Mrs. Ellison, her roses, her quiet courage. I wrote about Tom, who'd found his voice, and Javier, who'd turned anger into action. Mostly, I wrote about the power of standing together. The comment section became a community of its own, strangers sharing stories of defiance, from small acts like planting wildflowers to big ones like dismantling corrupt HOAs. I wasn't a hero, just a guy with a laptop and a story, but it felt good to give others a voice. My kids noticed the change in me. "You're happier, Dad," my daughter said one day, her hands muddy from helping in the garden. She was right. The fight had rebuilt me, too. Karen's absence left a void, but not the kind I'd expected. I thought I'd feel triumph, but instead, I felt a strange empathy. She'd been trapped in her own way, her need for control a cage of her own making. I wondered where she was, if she'd found peace or just another neighborhood to terrorize. I hoped she'd learned something, but I didn't dwell on it. My life was here, in the dirt and laughter and blooming chaos of my yard. The lawsuit threat faded, dismissed by a judge who saw through her bluster. The police never found proof she'd slashed my tires or left the note, but her moving away was proof enough. She'd lost her power, and that was enough for me. One spring morning, I woke to find a new flower in my garden, a single white lily planted in the night. No note, no explanation, just a quiet gesture. I suspected Priya, but she denied it with a smile. Maybe it was Mrs. Ellison's spirit, or just a neighbor saying thanks. I didn't need to know. It bloomed all summer, a symbol of something new. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. Arguments still flared, lawns still sparked debates, but we talked now, listened, worked it out. That was the real victory, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of connection. I stood in my yard that evening, the sun setting, my kids' voices drifting from the house. This was freedom, not just the right to plant flowers, but the right to live without fear, to build something real. I'd fought for it, and I'd fight again if I had to. For now, though, I was home.